Okay, whenever you're ready.
Excellent. Praxeology is the distinctive method of the Austrian School of Economics. The term was coined by Ludwig von Mises, who was not only the major architect and elaborator, but also the economist who most fully and successfully applied it to the construction of economic theory. Praxeology is an attempt to create a framework in which to understand the purposeful nature of human beings, allowing us to discover the universal laws of human action. It is a study of those aspects of human action that can be grasped a priori. In other words, it is concerned with the conceptual analysis and logical implications of preference, choice, means-end schemes, and so forth. Historically, the science grew out of economics, as Mises attempted to readdress what the subject matter of economics is about, as well as what kind of propositions economic theorems are. Asserting that economic logic didn't just explain prices and other market phenomena, but also the nature of all human decision-making, the general theory of choice and preference, Mises claimed, far surpassed the scope of economic problems addressed by economists from Cantillon, Hume and Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill. My dissertation featured 3 chapters. The first, an exposition of what the science is and its critics. The second, its methodology and critics. And the third, an attempt to restate the Austrian case against critical perspectives. This presentation will briefly cover an exposition of what the science is, the methodological diversity of its 2 major authors, critical perspectives, and a brief explanation of our responses, which I'm sure I'll have a chance to elaborate upon in the preceding time allotted for answering questions. Praxeology rests on the fundamental axiom that individual human beings act. That is, on the primordial fact that individuals engage in conscious action towards chosen goals. Mises defined human action as human will put into operation and transformed into an agency, aiming at ends and goals. Action is the ego's meaningful response to stimuli and to the conditions of its environment. It is a person's conscious adjustment to the state of the universe. The concept of action contrasts to purely reflexive or knee-jerk behaviour, which is not directed towards goals. The praxeological method is a deductive one, an idea first found in Aristotle's Posterior Ethics, in which Aristotle argues that a complete science must first start with a self-evident axiom, and by the use of deduction postulate the entire discipline. As such, the praxeological method spins out by verbal deduction the logical implications of the aforementioned primordial fact. In short, praxeological economics is a structure of logical implications of the fact that individuals act, and that by definition their action is purposeful. Let us consider some of the immediate implications of the action axiom. Action implies that individual behaviour is purposeful. In short, that it is directed towards goals. Furthermore, the fact of this action implies that the actor has consciously chosen certain means to reach his goals. Since he wishes to attain these goals, they must be valuable to him. Accordingly, he must have values that govern his choices. That he employs means implies that he believes that he has the technological knowledge that certain means will achieve his desired ends. Let us note that praxeology does not assume that a person's choice of values or goals is wise or proper, or that he has chosen the technologically correct method of reaching them. All that praxeology asserts is that the individual actor adopts goals and believes, whether erroneously or correctly, that he can arrive at them through the employment of certain means. All action in the real world, furthermore, must take place through time. All action takes place in some present and is directed towards the future attainment of some ends. If all a person's desires could be instantaneously realised, there will be no reason for him to act. Furthermore, that a man acts implies that he believes action will make a difference. In other words, that he will prefer the state of affairs resulting from action than that of no action. Action therefore implies that a man does not have omniscient knowledge about the future, for if he had such knowledge, no action would make any difference. Hence, action implies that we live in a world of an uncertain or not fully certain future. The fact that people act necessarily implies that the means employed are scarce in relation to the desired ends. If all means were not scarce but superabundant, the ends would have already been attained. There will be no need for action. Stated another way, resources that are superabundant no longer function as means because they are no longer the objects of action. Thus, air is indispensable to life and hence to the attainment of goals. However, air being superabundant is not an object of action and therefore cannot be considered a means, but rather what Mises called a general condition of human welfare. Where air is not superabundant, it may become an object of action. For example, where cool air is desired and warm air is transformed through air conditioning. Even with the absurdly unlikely advent of the emergence of a post-scarcity world in which all desires could be fulfilled instantaneously, there would still be at least 2 scarce means. The individual's time, each unit of which allocated to one purpose is necessarily not allocated to some other goal, as well as the individual's body. Indeed, choices about who can use it and how it can be used necessarily exclude other choices. One cannot simultaneously eat an apple, smoke a cigarette, climb a tree, build a house and ride a bike. When we must use means so that some ends remain unsatisfied, the necessity for choice among ends arises. Action, therefore, always involves both taking and renunciation. Some of the immediate implications of such are some of the immediate implications of this axiom of action. We arrived at them by deducing the logical implications from the existing fact of human action, and hence deduce true conclusions from a true axiom. Rothbard wrote that it is from this absolutely true axiom can be spun almost the whole fabric of economic theory. Some of the immediate logical implications that flow from this premise are the means-end relationship, the time structure of production, time preference, the law of diminishing marginal utility, the law of optimum returns, etc. Concerning the axiom itself, what is its epistemological status? How is this axiom proven to be true? Here the problems are obscured by a difference of opinion within the praxeological camp. Ludwig von Mises, as an adherent of the Kantian epistemology, asserted that the concept of action is a priori to all experience, because it is, like the law of cause and effect, part of the essential and necessary character of the logical structure of the human mind. Kant, in his critique of classical empiricism, formulated the idea that all propositions can be classified as either analytic or synthetic, summarised as follows. Propositions are analytic whenever formal logic is sufficient to find out whether they are true. Otherwise, propositions are synthetic. Furthermore, propositions are a posteriori whenever observational experience is necessary in order to establish their truth, or at least to confirm them. If observations are not necessary, then the propositions are a priori. Kant makes the remarkable claim that true a priori synthetic propositions can exist. Mises, employing this concept, saw that human action could demonstrate the existence of an a priori synthetic proposition, the truth of which can be unquestionably established even though the means of formal logic are insufficient and observations are unnecessary. Kant claimed that the truth of these propositions flows from self-evident material axioms. This does not mean that such statements are self-evident in a psychological sense, so that we be immediately aware of them. On the contrary, Kant insists it is usually much more painstaking to discover these axioms than it is to discover some empirical truth, like the leaves of trees are green. Instead, such propositions are self-evident because one cannot deny them without implicitly admitting their truth. We find these axioms by reflecting upon ourselves and understanding what it is about ourselves as knowing subjects. Observational experience can reveal things as they happen to be. Kant suggested that our reason can understand why things must necessarily be the way they are. Mises' insight was that the concept of human action constituted an a priori axiomatic truth, and suggested further that the concept is not simply a category of our mind, but that our mind is one of acting persons. And mental categories have to be understood as ultimately grounded in categories of action, and as soon as this is recognised, an epistemology claiming the existence of a true synthetic a priori propositions becomes a realistic epistemology. Excuse me. It is this epistemology that led Mises to argue that economic statements and propositions are not derived from experience. They are, like those of logic and mathematics, a priori. They are not subject to verification and falsification on the grounds of experience and facts. They are both logically and temporally antecedent to any comprehension of historical facts. Mises recognised that economics must rest, however indirectly, on our inner reflective experience as actors, which can claim to state something true a priori about reality. All that is needed, Mises wrote, for the deduction of all praxeological theorems is the knowledge of the essence of human action. It is a knowledge that is our own because we are human. No being of human descent that pathological conditions have not reduced to a merely vegetative existence lacks it. No experience, however rich, could disclose them to a being who did not know a priori what human action is. The only way to a cognition of these theorems is logical analysis of our inherent knowledge of the category of action. Like logic and mathematics, praxeological knowledge is within us. It does not come from without. The axiom of action and the associated proposition that human action is purposeful behaviour fulfills the criteria precisely for a true synthetic a priori proposition. Such a proposition simply cannot be denied, since such a denial would have to be categorised as an action, and so the truth of the statement cannot be undone. Any attempt to disprove the action axiom would itself be an action aimed at a goal, requiring means, excluding other courses of action, incurring costs, subjecting the actor to a possibility of achieving or not achieving the desired goal, and so leading to a perceived profit or loss. Furthermore, the axiom is not derived from empirical observation, since there are only bodily movements to be observed, but indeed no such thing as observable action. Instead, its truth is ascertained through inflective experience. Indeed, it is not observable that in order to accomplish his most highly valued goal, the actor must interfere or not, which of course by implication is also an interference, at an earlier point in time to produce a later result. nor is it observable that this action interfering in time necessarily implies the employment of some scarce means, and that these means must also for the actor have some value derived from the goal, since the actor regards their employment as necessary in order to effectively obtain the ends. Lastly, it is not plainly evident or observable that at its starting point, the goal of every action must by the actor be considered worth more than its cost and capable of resulting in a beneficial end. All of these categories, values, ends, means, choice, preference, cost, profit and loss, as well as time and causality, are implied in the axiom of action. Yet that human actors are able to interpret observation in such categories suggests explicitly that one already understands what it is and what it means to act. No one who is not a human actor, and hence not privy to the accumulated inner reflective knowledge, could understand them. Thus, for Mises, all true economic propositions can be deduced by means of formal logic from the unassailable knowledge regarding the meaning of action and its categories. Mises asserts, therefore, that subject to there being no flaw in the deductive process, the conclusion that such reasoning yields must be valid a priori, as their validity is founded on nothing but the indisputable axiom of action. Excuse me one moment. Rothbard, however, although a praxeologist, posits an entirely different epistemological position, resting on Aristotle and St. Thomas rather than Kant, and hence interprets the proposition differently, considering the axiom a law of reality rather than a law of thought, and hence empirical rather than a priori, which the mind apprehends from investigating and collating the facts of the real world. He wrote, "My view is that the fundamental axiom and subsidiary axioms are derived from the experience of reality, and are therefore in the broadest sense empirical. I would agree with the Aristotelian realist view that its doctrine is radically empirical, far more so than the post-Humean empiricism, which is dominant in modern philosophy." In addition to the foregoing considerations, Rothbard, however, like Mises, contended that the axioms are 1. So broadly based in common human experience that once enunciated, they become self-evident and hence do not meet the fashionable criterion for falsifiability. 2. They rest on universal inner experience as well as external experience, that is, the evidence is reflective rather than purely physical. And 3. That they are therefore a priori to complex historical events to which modern empiricism confines the concept of experience. This method sharply differentiates the praxeological method from the now orthodox schools of economics, which have increasingly adopted over the past century the method of the natural sciences. The ambition of Mises' work, however, was not to rectify the procedure of economics. Instead, he saw his achievement as a philosopher of economics in systematizing and in making explicit what economics really was, and how it had been implicitly conceived by almost everyone calling himself an economist. The contemporaries of Mises did not use the same Kantian terminology, such as a priori, but economists such as Jean-Baptiste Say, Nassau Senior, John E. Keynes and others described economics in a very similar way. For example, Keynes remarked that the economist starts with a knowledge of ultimate causes. The economist may thus be considered at the outset of his researches as already in possession of those ultimate principles governing the phenomena which form the subject of his study, the discovery of which in the case of physical investigation constitutes for the inquirer his most arduous task. Conjecture in economics would be manifestly out of place, inasmuch as we possess in our consciousness and in the testimony of our senses direct and easy proof of that which we desire to know. In political economy, accordingly, hypothesis is never used as a help towards the discovery of ultimate laws and causes. There are, of course, critics of the praxeological method, which I include at the end of my first 2 chapters of my dissertation, a few of which I will now briefly mention. Concerning firstly the postulates of praxeology, for example, while Mises claimed that action necessarily demonstrates preference, Kaplan argued that actors can feel genuine indifference in their available choices, and further suggested that an actor can have all sorts of preferences that are not and cannot be revealed in action. Gutierrez contested the idea that all means are scarce, objecting on the ground that recent technological, medical and social developments make it less improbable that a state of practical non-scarcity could someday be attained. He argued that while this axiom may well be true now, it is not axiomatically true, as future conditions may render it false. Concerning methodology, Gutierrez criticised the praxeological method by defending the logical positivist view that knowledge can either be known with apodictic certainty or have usefulness for understanding the real world, but not both. He argues that if praxeology is indeed a priori, it can have nothing to do with understanding reality. And if it has anything to do with understanding reality, the uniqueness of praxeology, its a priori nature, vanishes. He argues that deduction cannot add anything to our knowledge of reality. It merely makes explicit what was already implicit in the premises, and these premises are merely products of the mind and not derived from experience. What is deduced from them can assert nothing about the real state of the universe. Kaplan, again, although recognising that extrapolating economic theorems from axiomatic principles using logical deduction can often be a productive way of learning about the world, and that most neoclassical economists concede something similar, nonetheless criticises Mises and Rothbard for condemning the application of empirical testing within economics. He suggested, in particular, empirical evidence is often necessary to determine whether a theoretical factor is quantitatively significant. Lastly, Schuller, in his review of human action, criticised the Misesian axiomatic approach by suggesting that, although the step-by-step logical deduction from the action axiom may be effective, if the method requires a significantly long chain of logic as to require additional subsidiary postulates, the relation of reality at the endpoint of such deduction becomes tenuous. Schuller wrote that if Mises denies this, let him try to rewrite the book as a set of numbered axioms, postulates, and syllogistic inferences using, say, Russell's Principia or a series of mathematical propositions. Briefly, in my responses to these critics of praxeology, I attempted to demonstrate that often critics dismiss the science carelessly after mouthing a few phrases of rather dated, albeit scientific-sounding, methodological rhetoric. Many of the usual criticisms of the Austrian position prove unsuccessful because they proceed by assuming the validity of a rival epistemological position, i.e. positivism or falsification, and then proving the Austrian system does not meet the qualifications of their presumptively true system. Indeed, many of the complaints against praxeology, so often considered to be conclusive, are anticipated and answered by Mises, and many of those that remain often fail to take into account the epistemological and methodological foundations of the Austrian and neoclassical schools differ. Lastly, much of the hostility concerning Austrian rejection of positivism and empiricism in economics seems to translate into a demand that Mises should attempt to reconstruct the human brain and mind in all its possible variations from rudimentary logic, i.e. that Mises attempts to provide a complete mechanistic model of human nature. This seems to entirely miss the point that the Austrian economists are alone in recognising, that human nature is impossibly complex, that any attempt to model it is fraught with insurmountable theoretical problems. Those who wish to apply the calculus and variations to human behaviour as if human beings are so many whirling gears and levers, it appears to me, are guilty of passing over the complexities of human nature. Any empirical approach to social sciences must remain silent on human nature or must be guilty of oversimplifying human nature. Praxeology uniquely treats human nature as contentful, that we have some kind of nature by virtue of being humans, that we are not a tabula rasa or a blank slate. But avoids the mistake of glossing over the complexity of human nature with partial differential equations. Further, praxeology does not attempt to say what human nature is, beyond the fact that there is some human nature, and that it strives to attain aims through the use of means. The particular ends which humans choose compromise the content of human nature, and Mises explicitly recognises the identification of actual human ends as an empirical problem laying outside of the scope of praxeology. Thank you. I will now remit to the audience the question and a rigorous dressing down, I imagine.
Can I just ask you, Darren, do you think that it would be entirely feasible for somebody reflecting on the nature of the economic conditions of humanity to accept the entirety of the argument of von Mises and be a thoroughly committed Keynesian who wished to see intensive state intervention to guide and direct the economy?
It appears as if, unfortunately, in a mathematical approach to economics, which I know Keynes wasn't particularly fond of, but the thing is about concerning the empirical approach to economics, or the mathematical approach, the mathematical symbols have they gain their importance operationally, i.e. they don't have any significance other than what is already stated in the validity of logical deduction. So, for example, Hazlitt says, can I use the quote from Hazlitt, for example? If you want to find it for a moment, just bear with me. I use this in my dissertation. For example, a mathematical statement, to be scientifically useful, must, like a verbal statement, at least be verifiable, even when it is not verified. If I say, for example, that John's love of Alice varies in an exact and determinable relationship with Mary's love of John, I ought to be able to prove this is so, I do not prove my statement or make it a whit more plausible or scientific if I write solemnly, let X equal Mary's love of John and Y equal John's love of Alice. Then Y equals F to the power of X, and go on triumphantly from there. What I'm trying to get at is, to be a committed Keynesian, you must, in a sense, completely dismiss the axiomatic a priori approach to economics. So, if you're going to adopt a axiomatic approach to economics, which is the one that Mises espoused, you have to, of necessity, be in his same school of thought, as it were, in the same epistemological realm of positioning. Is what I'm trying to get at.
But then, okay, so your answer to my question was no. It's a very long version of no.
Sorry.
The answer was no. But then, what I don't understand is why that's no, because I'm not sure that the quotation that you've given us provides the reasoning. If, for instance, according to Rothbard, that the axiom of action is derivable only empirically, I mean it is derived empirically, then there is a sense, isn't there, in which one could accept the idea of human beings as action-oriented in the relevant sense here, but also think that there are aspects of what it is to be human in this economic world that requires, as Kaplan, for instance, suggests, considerable amounts of empirical information to know what the significance of those choices are. So under those circumstances, one can see reasons why one could be both a Misesian and a Keynesian.
But all that matters is the validity of the theory. So, for example, the procedure of the empirical sciences is to say, we mix two kinds of chemicals, for example. The hypothesis is if we mix two kinds of chemicals, that will lead to B. Say B is an explosion, for example. But that's only tentative knowledge. So we could introduce factor Z or B, and that could entirely change. We can only confirm or falsify a hypothesis in the scientific realm. Whereas if you look at a proposition like, for example, if we raise tomorrow the price of labour, the minimum wage, to £6 million per hour, the only way we could empirically test that is to institute in every society across the world forever persistently. But we know that follows logically from what we understand wages to be, and that if we prevent voluntary interactions between individuals, necessarily that, for example, if we prevent people from employing people at favourable rates for them, then it follows necessarily logically that there'll be excessive unemployment. But there's no need to empirically test that, apart from as to ascertain what the quantitative significance is. But if the theory of minimum wage holds true logically from the implied axiom, then necessarily we know ultimately that it hurts somebody. Somebody is being hurt. The quantitative significance is, I forgot who responds to him now, but it's ultimately a red herring. All that matters is that the theory holds true, and we know that someone is being hurt. So, despite the fact that they are a priori conceived, they still have relevance to the real world. There's no need to empirically test those.
Well, just one last question on this topic. I really don't follow that. I don't follow why the notion of hurt is being introduced here. I don't follow that simply because there's nothing in the axiomatic position that requires us to make judicial statements about the distribution of benefits of an action one way or another. Because the circumstances that one begins with in any economic intervention are themselves predicative. They dictate who benefits and who suffers from any situation. So my question to you then, given my confusion here, is this: when it comes to judging what it is that individuals will do in deploying scarce means to attain their goals, isn't it the case that the existing set of social circumstances both dictate to those agents their knowledge of what means are available, and dictate to them also what goals they value? And if that's true, if it's true, then to change those circumstances is no less unnatural than simply to assume that the given circumstances originally were arbitrary. Those circumstances are arbitrary, they can be changed. There's no moral attachment to it at all. And if that's not true, then I'm at a loss, because that means that we simply assume that human beings emerge from the womb possessed of goals and knowledge of how to achieve them through means.
It's not so much they emerge from the womb, but it's like the biological evolution of the human being. You know, we emerged from our pre-human existence as necessarily logical beings, in a sense that the development of reason and language are inseparably and necessarily linked with the evolution of man. So the praxeological categories of action and our inner reflective understanding of what it means to act are innate to the human being by virtue of the fact that that is what by virtue of the fact I apologise. They're innate to the human being by virtue of the fact of what a human being is. That's ultimately what praxeology is saying to us.
Yes.
But regarding your talking about the valuation of means and ends, praxeology doesn't say anything about the valuation of means or ends. It doesn't say that whether someone is employing means improperly or improperly. All it says is that humans do it, and that seems to be granted to us through inflection. We know through introspectively that we employ certain things to achieve our ends, but with regards to are the ends proper or are the means appropriate to achieve them, that is ultimately irrelevant.
Okay, let me try and push this in a slightly different direction. One of the interesting claims of praxeology is a sort of notion of putting human nature in its rightful epistemological place in the argument. And that is something that I'd certainly be very sympathetic to. But then I get puzzled, because whether you go for von Mises or Rothbard's sort of Kantian Aristotelian versions, isn't it the case that both of these thinkers make an unexamined and ultimately entirely unwarranted assumption precisely about human nature, namely that desire is the only possible goal of action, or motor of action if you prefer.
But when you say desire, it makes it seem as if what humans strive for is ultimately some sort of materialistic benefit.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No, I mean desire in its most general sense. Call it preference, call it appetite. If you're a Hobbesian, call it wants, doesn't matter. But that somehow, you know, when you say that, well, what you're doing, what you're rightly reporting is both thinkers think that somehow that the model of action is one which requires some sort of desire. Reason itself isn't enough. We only ever do things because we want to.
Yeah, the reason of action is to remove some sort of felt uneasiness from.
Yeah, but what evidence, either empirical or logical, is there for this very strange view?
It's introspective. I mean, we know. I mean, for example, the reason why I'm in this room right now is because I seek to attain a grade from my oral exam. The reason why I had a cigarette before I came in.
Excellent answer. But look, let me give you a different example and see what you make of that. The logic of your claim is that you never do anything unless, in some sense, at some level, you want to. Yeah? I mean, in one sense, you don't really want to.
Praxeologically defined, yeah. I mean, there are certain things which lay outside the realm of praxeological science, i.e., purely reflect. If you hit your knee with a hammer.
Yeah, but that's behaviour, not action.
Precisely.
So we don't need to worry about that. But if you're doing something, you do it because at some level you want to.
Yes.
Okay. So when you want to go to the pub and have a couple of pints, but you remember that you promised Auntie Flo that you'd go and see her in hospital. You don't want to go and see Auntie Flo in hospital at all, you want to go to the pub. But you might nonetheless go to the hospital. even though you don't want to.
But that's to do with the psychological definition of indifference, in a sense, which doesn't really lay a hand on the praxeological definition of indifference. So, for example, if I go to my cupboard in the morning and there's a green and a blue sweater, introspectively I could say I'm indifferent between those two. I don't really care which one I put on.
Right.
But as outside examiners, as economists, what are we supposed to infer from the prospect that someone picks up the green sweater and puts it on? I mean, if you say I picked up the green sweater and put it on, but introspectively I'm indifferent, and what are we supposed to infer? To say that there were two green sweaters, you picked up the green one and put that on, but you were indifferent between the two, seems nothing more than a logical contradiction.
No, you're conflating two quite different sorts of things, quite different sorts of issues here, I think. If you are indifferent between the two sweaters, then you're not doing anything at all. You're not choosing your picking.
That's true, not until you act, not until you...
That's fine, if you act at all. And you might not, you might just...
Well, even if you walk away, that's still an action.
Sure. But I don't see how that example damages the claim that we sometimes do things, not only that we don't want to do, but despite wanting not to. And this is not a psychological observation, it's a logical one.
I agree. But as I said, as outside, for example, the example that you gave about going to the pub or visiting your Auntie Flo in hospital, you might prefer to go and have a drink with your friends, but even if the preference is subconscious, even if it manifests itself in a way that isn't immediately implied in the actor's thinking, if he says, if it's for example, if it's an emotional disparaging to say, well, my family will ostracise me if I don't and go and visit Auntie Flo in hospital, by comparison to going to they still factor into a conscious decision making by the actor.
Well, that's the claim. What's the evidence for this claim?
Introspection.
Well, okay, but that seems remarkably weak, because I could claim that my introspection shows differently from von Mises's introspection, for instance. I don't see how introspection helps.
Well,
what I'm saying is that it appears that these two thinkers are simply assuming a Humean model of action.
Humean model?
Yes, from David Hume. I.e. that reason alone cannot result in action. There always has to be desire or motive.
Well,
reason is inert, if you like.
No, reason is I think Mises determined that reason is man's eminent feature, and that all decision making is in a sense reasoned, because that's the logical structure of
of course, I'm not denying that, but nonetheless he's committed to the view that if action is to arise from reasoning, then the actor in some sense has to want to perform that action rather than some other action.
Absolutely. But then...
we agree. All I'm suggesting is that is a highly questionable view of the logic of action. Now, I'm not saying, although I do think it's thoroughly mistaken, that doesn't matter. I'm not insisting that somehow I'm right about this, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of defending von Mises against that sort of philosophical move, if you like.
Admittedly,
it's the obvious one to make.
Admittedly, I'm somewhat confused. As I understand it, in the realm of logic, we can say that a person goes and visits Auntie Flo instead of going to the pub, and by necessity, as an observable, from what we understand of action introspectively, we can say, I do this because I prefer it over a certain alternative. So when I observe, for example, when I'm walking around Grand Central Station and when I'm walking through the Liverpool Street Station, there are lots of people meandering in different directions, and a non-human actor or a non-human species would look at that and say, that's chaotic, they're just interweaving, but as humans we know that what they're doing is ends orientated. So when we say I prefer to pick up this bottle of water rather than not do it to demonstrate my point, the same is true of that person going to visit Auntie Flo rather than going to the pub. So as such, that's like saying me going to visit Auntie Flo is something I didn't want to do despite the fact I did it anyway. It's kind of like saying, well, that's A, but it's also non-A, or it's all red, but it's also
sorry, but that is simply to repeat the assumption that I'm saying is a questionable one. Namely that you have to want to do something if you're to do it. And that's certainly the empiricist view of action. Certainly Aristotle's view of action. It's not Kant's view of action. That doesn't mean it's right, of course. Certainly, and that's one of the quite interesting things about von Mises. He picks up from Kant what what suits his purposes, without apparently noticing that Kant's view of practical rationality fundamentally undermines his own.
That's the thing. Mises
is right.
Mises employed the term a priori as merely a way to sort of demonstrate his argument. David Gordon points out that nothing really in Mises' whole epistemological system rests on Kant or Kantian epistemology, other than that there are some things which are innate to the human being a prior to all complex historical events. They are the necessary logical structure of the human mind. They are the tools indispensable to understanding the world innate within all human beings. So I agree with you on that point, but I'm still confused as to what an alternative would be, or how to appropriately respond in a sense.
Well, it's a very long story, but there are arguments available to
which you won't destroy now,
which I won't go into now. that you can have a model of action which makes no reference whatsoever to any form of motivation or desire.
But is that an empiricist claim?
Certainly not. Far from it. It's a Kantian claim. That's. I mean, I don't want to another place we could talk about. But I was just wondering if you'd considered those sorts of possible responses to, particularly to von Mises. But
the thing is I wish I knew enough about the position that you're espousing as to respond appropriately.
Perfectly good answer.
But I couldn't. I'm sorry.
It's fine.
I apologise.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Anybody else? What you were saying, in effect, repeating both Rothbard and Mises, even though they're deriving their position from in slightly different manners, is that any action performed by anybody is, by definition, as a result of it being an action, the pursuit of a want or a desire.
Yes.
Now, leave aside your criticism, their criticisms of falsificationism. Is there anything that would constitute evidence against their claim, in your view?
Evidence against their claim?
Yeah. Is there anything that could be observed, discovered, either as a result
of
empirical information or introspection, that would constitute a challenge to the claim that all action is the pursuit of a want or desire?
I suppose if we knew enough about neuroscience and we could map precisely what it is about chemical balances in the brain that leads to particular cognitive functions by human beings, that we could ascertain something which is contrary to it. But ultimately, in a sense, no, because I mean the main criticism of this position is that it's like a religion. It's kind of like a theology. Is that there's nothing really that we can say about the real world through empirical testing as to disprove the point that Rothbard and Mises are making, because it's based on, logical deduction from some stated axiom. So really, I can't personally think of anything, and I think that's partly the reason why much of the criticism, particularly from the falsificationists and positivists, fall on deaf ears. But
in that case, tell me what the difference is between adopting the praxeological position or an Austrian position in respect of economics and espousing Christianity or Judaism or Islam. Isn't this just a religious commitment to a particular way of thinking about what human beings are? I mean, it has divorced itself entirely from the realms of what might be described as a science.
But all that praxeology is saying ultimately is that we can ascertain through reflective experience that human beings do things consciously as to remove a state of felt uneasiness, whereas it doesn't prescribe the same way that religions do as what is the most appropriate way to live and interact with other human beings. Religion says that you should not lie with another man. Praxeology simply says is that we can ascertain that someone does that because of X, Y, and Z. It's as simple as that.
My question was not about the substance of religion and its quite clear contrast to the substance of praxeology. Mine was a methodological question. It was a reflection on method. Isn't the method that produces praxeology, this axiomatic method, comparable to, arguably methodologically identical to, the positing of the existence of God, which is the beginning and the end of the argument, because one either believes or one doesn't.
Is not logic and mathematics in the same vein as produced a prior to all complex historical events necessarily the same thing? Aren't they also, based upon some sort of religious verification or religious explanation? Is what I'm trying to get at. I mean, if you say that the praxeological science must be wrong by virtue of the fact that it is a priori to all complex historical events, then necessarily mathematics, which is in a similar vein, or formal logic, must be of the same sort.
But Darren, that can't work, surely, because there might be, this isn't an argument about whether these things are prior to experience. This is an argument about whether the commitment to the idea is logically defensible as opposed to insistently adopted as a condition for being a member of the club. The difference is that reason demonstrates that the logic of a mathematical deduction is demonstrated. There is nothing, is there, other than the presumption that human beings are seeking at once in the way that you described, subject to scarce means. Nothing other than that assumption that guarantees the outcome. It's not reason.
But you say presumption as if it's pulled out of the air, but the evidence is there. It's just not empirical in the sort of post-Humean empirical sense that now dominates Western philosophy. It's the evidence on which it's based on is introspective. I'm trying to respond as adequately as I can. I'm just slightly.
Can I come in on that?
Certainly.
It might be interesting if you said a bit about what you mean when you say that something's introspective, because maybe I don't understand it very well.
As I understand it, human action is determined as introspective by virtue of the fact that we can understand ourselves as acting beings. So, for example, like I said with the example of being in Liverpool Street Station, when people are walking around meandering in all different directions, we can look at them and say, I know that what they're doing is purposeful by virtue of the fact that I am a member of the same species. I am too a human being, and can know through inspection upon myself that what I am doing in this particular environment is also purposeful.
I'm sure that's absolutely right. I think that's a really good sort of picture. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't address the issue, because the issue is not how do we know that other people are acting rather than behaving. The issue is how do we know whether or not it's the case that desire, in some broad sense, is a necessary condition of action. That's a very different question. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier on. So I don't. Nice example though it is, I don't think it addresses this point.
Again, though, doesn't the satisfaction of some desire, isn't that also verified by the prospect of introspective understanding upon ourselves?
That may well be, but that doesn't help you either, because in the same way one might claim that introspection shows just as clearly that while sometimes we act in order to attain a desire, other times we act otherwise than to attain a desire.
Can you think of an example?
Well, lots and lots of them. We did that earlier on, but you wouldn't admit any of them. Now, I don't think that I could show that position very helpfully through introspection at all. What I think we'd need to do is some logic. I.e., I think it can be shown logically, not psychologically, that the Humean picture of motivation and action is radically mistaken. Now, again, I might be completely wrong about that, that's fine. But I suppose I'm trying to get a sense of whether in the literature there's any analysis of that possible objection to the whole enterprise of praxeology. I mean, I simply don't know if that's been done or not.
From what I understand, you're saying that there can be a logical refutation of the fact that action in the praxeological sense necessitates that human beings act upon some desire.
Yeah. But there is a case to be made there. I'm just wondering if anybody has made it in this context. I don't know.
I'm sure. I mean, the thing is, human action is a 5-volume treatise. It probably mentions it somewhere in there.
No. I wasn't thinking of that. I was thinking, are there any critics of von Mises who make this sort of argument? I simply don't know. That his whole notion of what action consists in is logically unsound. I don't care if they're right or wrong. That's not a matter. But has anybody said that sort of stuff in the literature?
Trying to think. Not that I've read. I mean, the only criticism which sounds roughly similar to what you're kind of inferring is Hodgson's critique, but that's to do more so with the.
That's different.
Yeah, it's entirely different. I personally can't think. I mean,
no, I just wondered.
If, for example, I apologise. If you could again provide me or give me an example of humans acting in a way that is not sufficient to the accomplishment of some felt desire.
I had absolutely no felt desire to turn up to this oral examination. I did, however, have a duty. An
obligation, absolutely, and your job matters to you, does it not?
That's right, but that's nothing to do with desire.
Of course it is. You want to maintain your job and position of employment, and that's your desire.
Well, I don't think we can go into it here because time's very nearly up. But the problem about that sort of response is that you end up suggesting that any action logically must be wanted at some level or another.
That's the claim.
But notice what happens logically to the claim. If everything counts as desire, even stuff that on the surface doesn't look like it, then to say that something is desired becomes empty. But we can talk about it later. Because it's now 1:45.
Well done. Finished.
Oh,